Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I want you to leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what your favorite part of the story turns out to be. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime content. Now, let's get into it. The morning fog clung to Millbrook Valley like a shroud, refusing to lift despite the October sun's feeble attempts to burn through it. Detective Sarah Chen had seen her share of crime scenes in 15 years with the state police, but nothing quite prepared her for what waited at 1247. Elm Street, the Victorian house, stood like a wounded giant among the manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood. Paint peeled from its weathered siding, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. It was the kind of house children dared each other to approach on Halloween, the kind that spawned ghost stories and urban legends. But the horror inside was all too real. Sarah pulled her coat tighter as she approached the front door, where Officer Martinez was waiting with a pale complexion and shaking hands. She'd known Martinez for 3 years, had seen him handle domestic violence calls and traffic fatalities without flinching, but something about this scene had rattled him to his core. "What do we have?" Sarah asked, pulling on latex gloves. "Anonymous. Tip came in at 6 this morning," Martinez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Caller said they could smell something terrible coming from the Brennan house. When we got here, the front door was unlocked." Sarah nodded. The Brennan house had been empty for months, ever since old Mrs. Brennan passed away and her nephew inherited the property. As far as anyone knew, it was supposed to remain vacant until the estate was settled. The smell hit us as soon as we opened. "The door," Martinez continued. "We did a preliminary sweep and found them in the basement. 3 bodies, detective, all posed." The word posed sent a chill down Sarah's spine. In her experience, killers who took time to arrange their victims were the most dangerous kind. They were methodical, careful, and almost always planned to kill again. Sarah stepped through the front door and was immediately assaulted by the stench of decomposition mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp. The house's interior was a time capsule from the 1970s, complete with avocado green appliances and orange shag carpeting. Dust motes danced in the week, sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The basement stairs creaked under her weight as she descended into the darkness below. Crime scene photographer Janet Wu was already at work, her camera flash illuminating the horror in stark, clinical detail. The basement had been transformed into something that resembled a theater. 3 wooden chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing a small stage area where someone had set up an old movie projector. The chairs weren't empty. The first victim was a young woman, probably in her 20s, with long blonde hair and wearing what appeared to be a waitress uniform. Her hands were bound behind the chair with zip ties, and her head was tilted back at an unnatural angle. The second was a middle-aged man in a business suit, his briefcase placed neatly at his feet. The third was another woman, older, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. But it wasn't just how they were arranged that made Sarah's stomach turn. It was what had been done to their faces. Each victim's eyes had been removed with surgical precision and replaced with old-fashioned glass doll eyes, the kind with movable lids that opened and closed depending on the angle. The effect was horrifying, as if 3 giant dolls were sitting in judgment of some macabre performance. "Time of death?" Sarah asked Dr. Patricia Webb, the medical examiner who had just arrived. "Based on the state of decomposition, I'd say they've been here at least a week," Maybe 10 days, Webb replied, pulling on her own gloves. I'll know more after the autopsies, but preliminary examination suggests they were killed elsewhere and brought here. Sarah walked closer to the makeshift stage, careful not to disturb any evidence. The movie projector was an antique, probably from the 1940s or 1950s. A film canister sat beside it, labeled in neat handwriting, "The Hollow Man, Episode 1. Has anyone touched the projector?" Sarah asked. "We've been waiting for you," Martinez replied from the stairs. "But detective, there's something else you need to see." He led her to a corner of the basement where someone had set up what appeared to be a dark room. Red lights hung from the ceiling, and developing trays were arranged on a long table. Photographs hung from a clothesline, still damp with chemicals. The photos showed the 3 victims in various stages of their final hours. Some appeared to be taken while they were still alive, their real eyes wide with terror. Others documented the killer's work, the careful removal and replacement of their eyes, the positioning of their bodies. But it was the final photograph that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed a 4th chair, empty and waiting, with a small placard that read Detective S. Chen. Sarah stepped backward, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. Someone had been watching her, studying her, planning for her involvement in this case before the bodies were even discovered. "We need to process this entire scene," she told Martinez. "And I want a patrol car outside my house 24/7 until we catch this psychopath." As the crime scene team began their methodical work, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The glass eyes of the victims seemed to follow her every movement, and she found herself wondering what kind of performance they had been forced to witness in their final moments. The movie projector sat silent in the corner, waiting to tell its story. But Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to hear what the Hollow Man had to say. The Millbrook Police Department hadn't seen this level of activity since the mill fire of 1987. FBI agents in dark suits moved through the hallways like sharks, their presence both reassuring and unsettling to the local force. Sarah had requested federal assistance as soon as she saw the photographs in the basement, knowing that this was beyond the scope of anything their small department had ever handled. Agent Michael Torres was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. Tall and lean with prematurely gray hair, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell about it. His specialty was serial killers, particularly those with elaborate staging rituals. "I've seen similar cases in Detroit and Phoenix," Torres said, studying the crime scene photos spread across the conference room table. The eye replacement, the theatrical staging, the photographing of the process. We're dealing with someone who sees murder as performance art. Sarah poured herself another cup of coffee, her 3rd of the morning. She'd barely slept since discovering the basement theater, haunted by those glass doll eyes and the empty chair with her nameplate. "What about the film?" she asked. "Have we been able to view it yet?" Torres nodded grimly. "We had our tech team set up the projector this morning. What we found confirms our worst fears." He dimmed the lights and started a laptop connected to a projector. The screen filled with grainy, black and white footage that had been digitized from the original film. The image quality was poor, reminiscent of old home movies, but the content was crystal clear. The film showed the 3 victims in what appeared to be a different location, possibly a warehouse or large garage. They were conscious and terrified, bound to chairs similar to those found in the basement. A figure moved between them, wearing dark clothing and a theatrical mask that covered the entire head. The mask was unsettling, painted white with exaggerated features that gave it an almost clown-like appearance. "He never speaks," Torres noted as they watched the masked figure methodically prepare his tools. "Everything is done in complete silence," which suggests a level of planning and control that's extremely dangerous. The film documented the entire process, the careful preparation, the victim's final moments, and the grotesque eye replacement surgery. But what disturbed Sarah most was how the killer moved. There was nothing frantic or emotional about his actions. He worked with the calm precision of a surgeon, taking breaks to adjust camera angles and lighting as if he were directing a movie. "This wasn't his first time," Sarah said. "Look how comfortable he is with the process, how smoothly everything flows." "That's what worries me," Torres replied. "This level of sophistication suggests we're dealing with someone who's been building up to this for years. The question is, how many practice runs did he take before this performance?" The film ended abruptly, but not before showing the killer arranging the bodies in the basement of the Brennan house. The final shot was of him placing the nameplate on the empty fourth chair, then turning to look directly into the camera. Even through the mask, Sarah could sense him smiling. "He wants us to find them," she realized. "This whole thing is a message." "But what's he trying to say?" Torres asked. Before Sarah could answer, Officer Martinez burst into the conference room. His face flushed with excitement and fear. "Detective, we just got another call. Someone found a package addressed to you at the post office. The postmaster called it in because it smelled like chemicals and had no return address." Sarah felt her stomach drop. The killer was reaching out to her directly, just as she'd feared. Torres immediately called for the bomb squad, and within an hour, the post office was evacuated while specialists examined the package. It turned out to contain no explosives, just another film canister and a handwritten note. The note was brief and written in the same careful script as the film label. "Detective Chen, thank you for appreciating my work. The show must go on. H." The film, labeled The Hollow Man Episode 2, contained footage that made Sarah's blood run cold. It showed her own house, filmed from various angles over what appeared to be several days. The killer had documented her daily routine, leaving for work in the morning, returning in the evening, checking her mail, walking her dog in the backyard. But more disturbing were the interior shots. Somehow, he had gained access to her home and filmed her private moments, eating dinner alone, watching television, sleeping in her bed. The invasion of privacy was complete and terrifying. "How long has he been watching me?" Sarah asked, her voice barely steady. Torres was studying the footage with professional detachment, but she could see the concern in his eyes. "Based on the different lighting conditions and your clothing changes, I'd say at least 2 weeks. Maybe more." 2 weeks, Sarah repeated. "He's been planning this since before the murders." The final shot of the film showed Sarah's empty bedroom at night, with a note placed on her pillow. The camera zoomed in slowly until the message was readable. "The audience grows restless. Time for Act 2. Sarah realized with growing horror that she wasn't just investigating this case, she was part of it. The killer had cast her as a character in his twisted theater, and she was now trapped in a performance where she didn't know the script. "We're moving you to a safe house," Torres declared. "Tonight." But even as Sarah nodded her agreement, she knew that running wouldn't solve anything. The Hollow Man had chosen her for a reason, and until she understood what that reason was, nowhere would truly be safe. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The show starts at midnight. Don't be late. The FBI safe house was a nondescript ranch-style home in a subdivision 40 miles outside Millbrook. It could have been any middle-class family's residence, complete with a minivan in the driveway and children's toys scattered across the front lawn. But Sarah knew that behind its mundane facade, the house was a fortress equipped with surveillance cameras, reinforced doors, and agents trained to kill. The drive to the safe house had been tense, with Agent Torres taking a circuitous route through back roads while constantly checking for surveillance. Sarah had tried to process everything she'd learned in the past few hours, but her mind kept returning to that photograph in the Brennan basement, the empty chair with her nameplate, waiting for her like a patient predator. We've had teams analyzing the films for the past 6 hours, Torres said as they pulled into the driveway. The level of technical sophistication is remarkable. Professional lighting, multiple camera angles, post-production editing. This isn't someone playing with a home movie camera. Sarah noticed how he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, even after they'd stopped. You think he followed us? I think he's been 10 steps ahead of us since this whole thing started, Torres admitted. The question is whether we can get far enough ahead to set a trap of our own. The interior of the safe house was exactly what Sarah had expected. Functional furniture, bland decorating, and the sterile feeling of a place where no one actually lived. But as they conducted their security sweep, she noticed details that suggested the house's cover story was more elaborate than she'd realized. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, showing a fictional family through various stages of life. School awards and children's artwork decorated the refrigerator. Someone had even gone to the trouble of creating a lived-in mess in the master bedroom, complete with rumpled clothes and half-read books on the nightstand. How long has this place been operational? Sarah asked Agent Park. 3 years, Park replied, checking the locks on all the windows. We use it primarily for witness protection, though we've housed a few federal judges who received credible death threats. Sarah studied the family photographs more carefully. The same faces appeared in image after image, aging naturally over what appeared to be 15 or 20 years. Someone had created an entire fictional family history, complete with birthday, parties, graduations, and holiday celebrations. The attention to detail is incredible, she murmured. Standard protocol for long-term safe houses, Park explained. The deeper the cover, the more effective the protection. Neighbors need to believe a real family lives here, or the whole illusion falls apart. But as Sarah continued examining the photographs, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In one of the images, a family barbecue that appeared to be from several years ago, she could see a figure in the background, partially obscured by shadows and other people, but unmistakably wearing the same style of clothing she'd seen in the Hollow Man's films. Agent Park, she called, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. How long has this safe house been compromised? Park rushed over to examine the photograph, and Sarah watched the color drain from her face as she spotted the same figure. That's impossible. These photos were generated by our cover team using stock images and digital manipulation, unless someone on your cover team isn't who they appear to be. Sarah said. The house suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every creak of the old building's structure sounded like footsteps on the stairs. The Hollow Man had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate their moves, and now Sarah was beginning to understand. How? We need to evacuate immediately, Park said, reaching for her radio. but the device produced only static. "The phones," Sarah said, checking her secure cell phone. "No signal. Electronic jamming," Park confirmed. "Military grade, by the look of it. Someone doesn't want us calling for help." They were trapped in a house that was supposed to be their sanctuary, surrounded by neighbors who had no idea that the fictional family next door was about to become very real victims. The Hollow Man's midnight deadline was still hours away, but Sarah realized now that it had never been about the Brennan house. It had always been about bringing her here, to this basement, for a performance that had been planned for much longer than she'd realized. Agent Torres had assigned 2 of his best people to her protection detail. Agent Lisa Park, a former Marine sniper with ice-cold composure who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Bureau, and Agent David Rodriguez, a surveillance specialist who could spot trouble from 3 blocks away and had survived an assassination attempt in Chicago just 2 years prior. Both had dealt with serial killers before, but Sarah could see the tension in their faces as they briefed her on security protocols. No windows, no standing in doorways, no predictable routines, Park explained as they walked through the house, her eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. "We have cameras covering every approach, motion sensors in the yard, and backup is 15 minutes away. But given what we've seen from this killer, we're not taking any chances." Rodriguez was setting up additional surveillance equipment as they talked, his movements precise and efficient. "The jamming equipment tells us we're dealing with someone with military or intelligence training," he said without looking up from his work. "This level of operational security doesn't come from reading books or watching movies." Sarah nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about the text message and the midnight deadline that was now only 6 hours away. What would happen when the Hollow Man's show began and she wasn't there to play her part? Her phone had been confiscated and replaced with an untraceable device monitored by the FBI. Her personal laptop was locked away, replaced with a secure terminal that could only access law enforcement databases. Even her clothes had been changed, replaced with garments that had no electronic devices or tracking capabilities. They'd even brought in a bomb-sniffing dog to check her personal effects for any hidden surprises. But despite all these precautions, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still one step behind. The Hollow Man had demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate their moves, and his message suggested he expected her absence. More troubling was the possibility that he'd planned for it, that her being brought to the safe house was exactly what he'd wanted all along. The house itself told a story of meticulous preparation. Everything from the furniture placement to the contents of the refrigerator had been designed to support the cover identity of the fictional family. Sarah found herself wondering how many real families had unknowingly contributed to the illusion. Their photographs digitally altered, their children's artwork recreated by federal employees, their daily routines studied and replicated at 10:30 p.m. Torres called with an update from the command center they'd established at the police station. "We've got teams positioned around your house and the Brennan property. Thermal imaging shows no movement inside either location, but we're maintaining surveillance. If he shows up for his midnight performance, we'll be ready." "And if he doesn't?" Sarah asked, though she was increasingly certain that the real performance was happening exactly where she was. Torres was quiet for a moment. "Then we wait for his next move and hope we can stay ahead of him." The safe house felt increasingly claustrophobic as the night wore on. Sarah paced the living room, her mind racing through every detail of the case. The Hollow Man's theatrical approach suggested someone with extensive knowledge of film and performance art. The surgical precision of the eye replacements pointed to medical training or at least anatomical expertise. The elaborate staging required significant time and resources. This wasn't some random psychopath acting on impulse. This was someone with means, intelligence, and a very specific agenda that went far beyond simple revenge. The theatrical elements suggested someone who understood the power of narrative, who knew that a well-told story could have more impact than any number of random murders. At 11:15, Agent Park noticed something that made her blood run cold. "Rodriguez, come look at this," she called from the kitchen window. Rodriguez joined her, and Sarah could see both agents tense as they studied something in the backyard. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "The motion sensors should have detected that," Park said, pointing toward a figure standing motionless under the large oak tree at the back of the property. "But we're getting no alerts from the perimeter system." The figure was roughly human-sized, but completely still, like a scarecrow or mannequin. In the darkness, it was impossible to make out details, but there was something deeply unsettling about its presence. "Could be a decoy," Rodriguez suggested. "Something to draw our attention while the real threat approaches from another direction." But as they watched, more figures appeared in the yard. First one, then three, then half a dozen, all standing in perfect silence among the trees and shrubs. They appeared to be wearing identical dark clothing and were positioned at strategic points around the house. "Are those people or—" Park began, then stopped as she realized the horrible truth. They weren't moving because they couldn't move. The figures in the yard were corpses, positioned with the same theatrical precision the Hollow Man had used in the basement scenes. But these weren't his recent victims. Based on their positioning and condition, they had been placed there days or even weeks ago. The safe house has been compromised from the beginning, Sarah realized. He's been using it as his own private theater, staging scenes in the backyard while we thought we were protecting witnesses inside. Rodriguez was frantically trying to re-establish communication with the command center, but the jamming was complete. They were isolated in a house surrounded by the dead, with no way to call for help and no certainty about what other surprises the Hollow Man had prepared. At 11:45 p.m., the lights went out. Someone had been spotted approaching the Brennan house, moving through the shadows with practiced stealth. "All units, we have a possible suspect approaching from the east side," came the voice of Agent Martinez, who was coordinating the stakeout. Male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. Sarah listened intently as the teams moved into position. This was it, their chance to end the nightmare before it could escalate further. But at exactly midnight, Sarah's secure phone rang. The caller ID showed only a string of zeros, but somehow she knew who it was before she answered. "Hello, Detective Chen," came a calm, cultured voice. "I trust you're comfortable in your new accommodations." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "I think you know," the voice replied. "Though I must say, I'm disappointed. We had such a lovely performance planned, and you failed to take your place on stage." Agent Park was already signaling to Rodriguez, who began tracing the call, but Sarah suspected it would lead nowhere. The Hollow Man was too careful for such simple mistakes. "What do you want?" Sarah asked. "To tell a story," he replied. "Your story, detective. The story of a woman who thought she understood the nature of truth, only to discover that reality is far more malleable than she ever imagined." Through the radio chatter, Sarah could hear the surveillance teams closing in on the figure near the Brennan house. But something was wrong. The suspect wasn't trying to hide or escape. He was simply standing in the open, waiting. "The man your colleagues are about to arrest is not me," the voice on the phone continued, as if reading her thoughts. "He's simply another actor in tonight's performance. A homeless man who was paid $50 to walk past the house at midnight." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the truth. While they'd been focused on protecting her and watching the Brennan house, the Hollow Man had been executing an entirely different plan. "Then where are you?" she demanded. "Closer than you think, detective. Much closer." The phone went dead, and in the silence that followed, Sarah became aware of a sound she hadn't noticed before. Classical music, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere inside the safe house. Agent Park heard it too, her hand moving instinctively to her weapon. The music was coming from the basement, a haunting violin piece that seemed to float through the floor like a ghost. "Rodriguez," Park whispered into her radio. "We have a situation. The subject may be inside the house." But Rodriguez didn't respond. His radio produced only static. Park moved toward the basement stairs with Sarah close behind. The music grew louder as they descended, joined now by what sounded like an old film projector clicking steadily in the darkness below. The basement had been transformed, just like the one at the Brennan house. 3 chairs faced a makeshift screen where black and white images flickered in the dark. But this time, the chairs weren't occupied by corpses. They held Agent Rodriguez and 2 other FBI agents Sarah didn't recognize, all unconscious but breathing. In the center of the room stood a figure in the now familiar white mask, operating an antique film projector. He turned toward them as they reached the bottom of the stairs, and Sarah could see him smile beneath the painted features. "Welcome to Act 2, he said, in the same cultured voice from the phone. "I've been so looking forward to meeting you in person, Detective Chen." Agent Park raised her weapon, but the Hollow Man was faster. A tranquilizer dart caught her in the neck, and she collapsed before she could pull the trigger. Sarah found herself alone with a killer in a basement that had become his theater, watching her colleagues sleep in chairs like an audience waiting for a show to begin. "Shall we start the performance?" the Hollow Man asked, gesturing toward a 4th chair that had been placed facing the others. Sarah realized with growing terror that she was no longer the detective investigating the case. She had become the final act in the Hollow Man's twisted play. The Hollow Man moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, every gesture calculated and precise. Sarah watched him from where she stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, trying to assess her options while fighting the paralyzing fear that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. "Please, detective, take your seat," he said, indicating the empty chair with a theatrical bow. "The performance cannot begin until all the players are in position." Sarah's training kicked in. Keep him talking, look for weaknesses, wait for an opportunity. "The other victims," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The waitress, the businessman, the nurse, why them?" The Hollow Man tilted his head, considering her question. "Ah, you want to understand the casting choices. How refreshingly professional of you." He moved to the film projector and made an adjustment, causing the images on the makeshift screen to shift and change. Each of them played a role in a larger story. "Detective. The waitress, Jennifer Martinez, worked at the diner where my mother met her killer 30 years ago. She served him coffee while he convinced her to leave with him. Such a small part, yet crucial to the tragedy that followed." The screen now showed newspaper clippings from 3 decades past. "Local woman found murdered. Police seek killer in brutal slaying. Case goes cold after 6 months. The businessman, Robert Chen, no relation to you. Merely a coincidence. Of surnames was the prosecutor who plea bargained my mother's killer down to manslaughter. 12 years instead of life. Such a reasonable compromise, don't you think? Sarah felt her stomach turn as she began to understand the scope of the Hollow Man's obsession. This wasn't random violence. It was methodical revenge, played out over decades. And the nurse, Patricia Webb, worked at the hospital where my mother was taken after the attack. She might have lived if someone had acted faster, shown more urgency, but Nurse Webb was on her break, you see, taking time to finish her crossword puzzle while my mother bled out in the hallway. The film images shifted again, showing what appeared to be hospital records and personnel files. The level of research was staggering, suggesting years of patient investigation and planning. But none of them were the real star of the show. The Hollow Man continued, turning back to Sarah. They were simply the supporting cast, building to this moment when the true protagonist takes the stage. I wasn't involved in your mother's case, Sarah said, still looking for any chance to escape or turn the tables. I would have been a child. 30 years ago. No, you weren't involved then, he agreed. But you became involved the moment you chose to pursue a career in law enforcement. You became part of the system that failed her, the same system that let her killer walk free after serving only 8 years of his reduced sentence. The Hollow Man moved closer, and Sarah could see her own reflection in the glass eyes of his mask. Do you know what happened to him after his release, detective? The man who took my mother from me. Sarah shook her head, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. He disappeared, the Hollow Man said with satisfaction. Vanished without a trace just 3 months after his parole ended. The police investigated, of course, but they found nothing. No body, no evidence, no resolution. Just another cold case gathering dust in some filing cabinet. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. This wasn't the beginning of the Hollow Man's killing spree. It was simply the first time he'd chosen to make his work public. How many others have there been? Sarah asked. Oh, detective, that would spoil the surprise. But don't worry, tonight's performance will reveal all the secrets, every twist, every revelation, every carefully planned moment that has led us to this basement. He gestured again toward the empty chair. Now please, take your place. My actors are waiting, and the show must go on. Sarah looked at the unconscious FBI agents, searching for any sign that they might wake up and help her. But Rodriguez's breathing was deep and regular, suggesting he'd been given a substantial dose of whatever drug the Hollow Man was using. If I sit in that chair, I die, Sarah said, just like the others. Death is certainly one possible ending, the Hollow Man agreed. But I'm a storyteller, detective, not a simple killer. The best stories have multiple possible conclusions, don't they? The choice of which ending we reach depends entirely on how well you play your part. He moved to a small table Sarah hadn't noticed before, revealing an array of antique surgical instruments laid out with museum-like precision. The sight made her blood run cold. You see, the beauty of live theatre is its unpredictability. Unlike film, which captures a single version of events, live performance allows for improvisation, for the audience to influence the outcome. Tonight, Detective Chen, you are both performer and audience, protagonist and critic. The Hollow Man selected a scalpel from the collection, testing its edge against his gloved thumb. The question is, Will you embrace your role and help me tell the story I've spent 30 years crafting? Or will you force me to write a different ending altogether? Sarah realized that her next decision would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the lives of the unconscious agents around her. The Hollow Man wasn't just a killer. He was a master manipulator who had orchestrated this entire scenario to give her the illusion of choice while ensuring that every option served his ultimate purpose. As she stood frozen between the stairs and the waiting chair, Sarah understood that she was trapped in more than just a basement. She was caught in the final act of a 3-decade-long performance, and the Hollow Man was determined to see it through to its conclusion. The only question was whether that conclusion would be his ending or hers. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at the surgical instruments, searching for any detail that might give her an advantage. The Hollow Man's meticulous planning was both his strength and potentially his weakness. Someone this obsessed with perfection might be thrown off by unexpected improvisation. "Before I decide anything," she said, taking a small step backward toward the stairs, "I want to understand the full story. You said this has been 30 years in the making. Tell me about your mother." The Hollow Man paused in his examination of the scalpel, and Sarah sensed she'd struck something important. Behind the mask, she could feel his attention sharpen. "My mother was Elena Vasquez," he said, and there was genuine emotion in his voice for the first time. "She was 26 years old, working 2 jobs to support us after my father left. Beautiful, kind, trusting to a fault." He moved to the film projector and changed reels with practiced efficiency. New images appeared on the screen. A young woman, with dark hair and a radiant smile, holding a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She met Thomas Brennan at the Millbrook Diner on a Tuesday night in October 1994. He was charming, well-dressed, claimed to be a traveling salesman. She was tired and lonely, and when he offered to walk her to her car after her shift, she accepted. The images shifted to crime scene photos that made Sarah's stomach clench. Elena Vasquez had been found in the woods outside town, her body bearing signs of prolonged torture before her eventual death. The police investigation was a joke, the Hollow Man continued, his voice hardening. They decided she was just another woman who'd made a bad choice, gotten involved with the wrong man. When they finally arrested Brennan, the prosecutor was more interested in closing cases than seeking justice. Sarah felt a chill as she realized the significance of the name. The Brennan house where you left the first 3 bodies, Thomas Brennan's childhood home, inherited from his aunt. He sold it after his release and moved away, but I made sure to acquire the property when it came back on the market years later. Poetic justice, don't you think? The Hollow Man set down the scalpel and moved closer to Sarah, his movements still fluid and controlled. But the real injustice was what happened next. 8 years, detective, 8 years for taking my mother's life, for destroying mine, for creating the Hollow Man you see before you. "What's your real name?" Sarah asked. "Names are just labels, detective. What matters is purpose, and my purpose has been singular for 3 decades. To show the world what justice really looks like when the system fails." He gestured toward the unconscious agents. "Agent Rodriguez has a daughter. Did you know that? 10 years old, same age I was when I lost my mother. Agent Park volunteers at a children's hospital on weekends, reading stories to young patients. Both of them dedicated their lives to protecting others, just as you have." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You're saying they don't deserve to die?" "I'm saying that their fate depends on choices you're about to make," he replied. "Just as my Mother's fate depended on the choices made by others 30 years ago. The waitress who could have refused to serve a man who made her uncomfortable. The prosecutor who could have fought for a life sentence. The nurse who could have prioritized an emergency over a crossword puzzle. The revelation that the hollow man wasn't working alone changed everything Sarah thought she understood about the case. As Dr. Santos and her masked partner moved through the basement with practiced coordination, Sarah realized she was facing something far more dangerous than a single deranged killer. She was confronting an organized network of people who had weaponized their grief. "How many of you are there?" Sarah asked, trying to assess the tactical situation while keeping both killers in sight. "Enough," Dr. Santos replied, removing her mask to reveal a woman in her 30s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held the same hollow quality Sarah had noticed in crime scene photographs. "Every major city has at least 2 or 3 people like us, highly educated, personally affected by system failures, and tired of waiting for justice that never comes." The male figure, Dr. Vasquez, Sarah assumed, began setting up the antique film projector with the same methodical precision she'd seen in the recorded murders. "We've been recruiting carefully for 5 years now," he said. "Doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, all people with the skills and resources necessary to research cases and execute justice." Sarah looked at the bound figures in the chairs and felt her stomach turn as she recognized not just Agent Torres, but also District Attorney Patricia Webb and Judge Richard Morrison, the son of the detective who had investigated Elena Vasquez's murder 30 years ago. "You're targeting the children," she realized. "The next generation of the system that failed you. We're ensuring that the lessons of the past aren't forgotten," Dr. Santos corrected. "These 3 represent the ongoing failures of the justice system. Darweb has plea bargained away 14 murder cases in the past 2 years. Judge Morrison has a pattern of imposing minimum sentences for violent crimes. Agent Torres supervised the investigation that allowed 3 serial killers to continue operating because of bureaucratic delays." The level of research was staggering. Sarah could see files spread across tables in the basement, each one containing detailed dossiers on their captives. Photographs, financial records, case histories, personal information. The network had clearly spent months or years studying their targets. "This isn't justice," Sarah said. "This is terrorism. The distinction becomes meaningless when the official justice system ceases to function," Dr. Vasquez replied, loading a film reel into the projector. "Would you call the French resistance terrorists for fighting Nazi occupation? Would you condemn escaped slaves for killing their masters?" "Those are completely different situations," Sarah protested. "Are they?" Dr. Santos asked. "In each case, people decided that an unjust system had to be opposed through direct action when legal channels proved inadequate." The film projector clicked to life, casting black and white images across a screen that had been set up facing the bound captives. Sarah recognized the footage from the Brennan House murders, but this version had been edited differently, with additional commentary and statistical overlays. "We're not just killing people," Dr. Vasquez explained as gruesome surgery footage played on the screen. "We're creating an educational resource. Every murder is documented from beginning to end, with complete case histories showing exactly how the justice system failed the original victims." Sarah watched Agent Torres struggle against his restraints as the film showed the careful removal and replacement of glass eyes. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical violence, designed to break down the captive's mental defenses before the actual killing began. The film served multiple purposes, Dr. Santos continued, adjusting the lighting to ensure the captives could see every detail of their predecessors' fates. They document our work for posterity. They provide training materials for new network members, and they serve as a final lesson for people like these three who still believe the system can be reformed. Sarah realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented in criminal history. Not just a serial killer, but an organized movement with cells in multiple cities, documented procedures, and a recruiting system that had been operating undetected for years. How many cities? She asked. 12 active cells currently, Dr. Vasquez replied without hesitation. We've documented over 200 system failures and executed justice in 47 cases. Tonight's performance will mark the beginning of our public phase. Until now, we've operated in secret, making individual deaths appear unrelated, Dr. Santos explained. But we've reached the point where silence serves no purpose. The network is strong enough to survive exposure, and the story is compelling enough to attract new members. Agent Park had been quiet during this exchange, but Sarah could see her evaluating angles and distances, looking for any opportunity to turn the situation around. Unfortunately, the basement layout favored the killers, with multiple exit points and clear fields of fire. What makes you think people will support you? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the psychology driving the network. Because the system is failing everyone except the criminals, Dr. Vasquez replied, his voice gaining passion. Every parent who has lost a child to a repeat offender, every victim's family who has watched a killer walk free on a technicality, every police officer who has seen their work undermined by corrupt prosecutors, they all understand what we're doing, even if they lack the courage to do it themselves. The film on the screen shifted to news footage of grieving families, victim impact statements, and statistics about recidivism rates and plea bargain frequencies. The presentation was professionally produced and emotionally devastating, designed to build sympathy for the network's cause while justifying their methods. You're creating propaganda, Sarah realized. We're creating truth, Dr. Santos corrected. Raw, unfiltered truth about what justice looks like when people stop waiting for institutions to save them. As the film continued, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the network's ambitions. This wasn't just about revenge for individual cases. It was about replacing the entire justice system with something fundamentally different, something based on direct action rather than legal procedure. The question was whether they could be stopped before their public phase inspired others to follow their example, creating a wave of vigilante violence that could destroy the rule of law entirely. Agent Torres had stopped struggling and was now listening intently to the conversation, his law enforcement training helping him gather intelligence even while bound and gagged. Sarah could see him trying to memorize details about the network's structure and operations. The performance begins in 10 minutes, Dr. Vasquez announced, checking an antique pocket watch. Detective Chen, it's time for you to take your place as the final witness to our work. But as Sarah looked at the empty chair that had been prepared for her, she realized that she still had one advantage the network hadn't anticipated. Unlike their previous victims, she knew their story, understood their motivation, and had spent years studying the same system failures that had driven them to murder. The question was whether that knowledge would be enough to save her life and the lives of the people counting on her. The antique pocket watch in Dr. Vasquez's hand ticked with mechanical precision as midnight approached. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on the basement like a physical force. The The culmination of 30 years of planning and 5 years of careful recruitment coming to its inevitable conclusion. Detective Chen, Dr. Santos, said, gesturing toward the empty chair with theatrical flourish, "Your audience awaits." Sarah looked at the bound figures of Torres, Darweb, and Judge Morrison. Their eyes were wide with terror, but she could also see a desperate hope that somehow she would find a way to save them. The responsibility was crushing, for lives hung in the balance, and any wrong move could result in a massacre. "Before I make any decision," Sarah said, "I want to understand something. Dr. Santos, you said you lost your brother to a drunk driver. What happened to the driver?" Dr. Santos paused in her preparation of surgical instruments, clearly not expecting the question. He served 18 months in county jail and was released with time served and probation, and then he killed a family of 4 in a head-on collision 6 months later, Dr. Santos replied, her voice hardening. 3 children under the age of 10 and their mother, all dead because the system gave a killer another chance to kill. Sarah nodded sympathetically. "So you found Dr. Vasquez and joined his network?" "He found me," Dr. Santos corrected. 3 days after the second accident, David appeared at my clinic. He knew everything about my brother's case, about my medical background, about the rage that was eating me alive from the inside. Dr. Vasquez checked his watch again. 5 minutes, Detective. The film equipment is recording, and our colleagues in other cities are standing by to begin their own performances. Tonight marks the beginning of a new era in American justice. Colleagues in other cities, Sarah repeated, her heart sinking as she realized the true scope of what they were facing. This is happening everywhere tonight. Simultaneous actions in 12 cities, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. Each cell has identified their targets, prepared their theaters, and is ready to broadcast their work to the world. By tomorrow morning, every major news network will be covering our story. Agent Rodriguez had been working quietly at his restraints, and Sarah could see that he'd managed to loosen one of the zip ties binding his wrists. But he was still several minutes away from freeing himself, and they didn't have several minutes. The beauty of simultaneous action, Dr. Santos explained as she laid out additional surgical tools, is that it prevents law enforcement from coordinating an effective response. While the FBI is focused on our work here, similar scenes are playing out in Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, and 9 other cities. Sarah felt a chill as she imagined dozens of basements across the country, each one filled with bound victims and elaborate staging, each one documenting the network's twisted vision of justice. The scale of the conspiracy was breathtaking. "You're going to trigger a national crisis," she said. "We're going to force a national conversation," Dr. Vasquez corrected. For too long, the failures of the justice system have been hidden behind bureaucratic language and legal technicalities. Tonight, we're going to show the American people what those failures actually look like. The film projector began rolling, casting new images across the screen. These weren't the surgical procedures Sarah had seen before. They were news footage from previous cases, showing grieving families, repeat offenders walking free, and statistics about the growing gap between crime and punishment. "This is our manifesto," Dr. Santos said proudly. 3 hours of documentation showing exactly how the system has failed and exactly what we've done to correct those failures. Sarah watched footage of herself at the Brannan House crime scene, her investigation, documented from angles she'd never noticed. Hidden cameras had captured every moment of her work, every conversation with colleagues, every expression of frustration with the system's limitations. "You've been creating a narrative around my investigation," she realized. "We've been creating a narrative around the system's final failure," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Your investigation represents the last attempt to work within official channels. When it fails, when you die here tonight, it will demonstrate that the old way of seeking justice is completely bankrupt." Agent Torres was making muffled sounds behind his gag, trying to communicate something urgent. Sarah could see desperation in his eyes, not just for his own life, but for something larger. 2 minutes, Dr. Vasquez announced, and Sarah could hear excitement creeping into his voice. "Detective Chen, please take your seat. The other cells are waiting for our signal to begin their own performances." Sarah looked around the basement theater, at the elaborate staging and professional equipment, at the bound victims and the carefully positioned corpses in the yard. The Hollow Man had created a monument to systemic failure, but in doing so, he had become the very thing he claimed: to oppose someone who took innocent lives to serve his own agenda. "I have a different idea," Sarah said, making a decision that would either save them all or get them all killed. "Instead of me taking that chair, why don't you take off your masks and show your faces to the camera?" Both killers paused, clearly not expecting this suggestion. "Think about it," Sarah continued. "If you really want to start a national conversation about justice, people need to see who you are. They need to understand that you're not monsters. You're victims of the same system you're fighting against." Dr. Santos looked at Dr. Vasquez uncertainly. "David, that wasn't part of the plan." "Plans change," Sarah said. "Real justice requires transparency, doesn't it? If you truly believe in your cause, show the world your faces. Tell your stories without hiding behind theatrical masks." Dr. Vasquez hesitated, his hand moving toward the mask. Sarah could see him weighing the implications of her suggestion, trying to decide whether revealing himself would serve his larger purpose, or simply make him vulnerable to identification and capture. "1 minute," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Sarah pressed her advantage. "Dr. Vasquez, your mother died because people made cowardly choices, because they prioritized their own comfort over doing what was right. Don't make the same choice she died fighting against." As the seconds ticked toward midnight, Sarah realized that the next 60 seconds would determine not just the fate of everyone in the basement, but potentially the future of justice in America. The network's simultaneous actions across 12 cities would either mark the beginning of a new era of vigilante violence, or the exposure and destruction of a terrorist organization that had been operating in the shadows for years. The choice was no longer just about who lived or died in this basement. It was about what kind of country they wanted to live in, and whether the rule of law could survive the complete breakdown of faith in the institutions designed to protect it. Dr. Vasquez reached up and began to remove his mask as the clock struck 12. Chapter 6. The face behind the mask. The white mask fell away, revealing a face that was both handsome and haunted. Dr. David Vasquez appeared younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps in his late 30s, with the kind of refined features that belonged in a medical journal or university faculty photo. But his eyes held a darkness that spoke of decades spent nursing grief and rage. "There," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Is that what you wanted, Detective Chen? The face of justice unmasked?" Dr. Santos hesitated for a moment, then followed his lead. revealing a woman with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that were re-dimmed from years of crying. She looked like someone who had once been beautiful before sorrow carved permanent lines around her mouth and eyes. "My name is Dr. Maria Santos," she said to the camera. "I'm a trauma surgeon at Millbrook General Hospital. I save lives for a living, but tonight I'm here to take them." Sarah could see Agent Rodriguez had almost worked his hands free, but she needed to keep the killers talking for a few more minutes. "Dr. Santos, you took an oath to do no harm. How do you reconcile that with what you're doing here?" "I reconcile it by understanding that sometimes harm to the guilty prevents greater harm to the innocent," Dr. Santos replied. "Every person we've eliminated was directly responsible for deaths that could have been prevented if the system had functioned properly." Dr. Vasquez moved closer to the camera, his face filling the frame with intense conviction. People watching. This need to understand that we didn't choose violence. Violence was chosen for us when the system failed so completely that legal remedies became meaningless. The basement fell silent except for the worry of the film equipment and the muffled breathing of the bound victims. Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, the sense that whatever happened next would echo through the justice system for generations. "David," she said quietly, "your mother wouldn't recognize the man you've become." The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, the carefully maintained composure cracked, and Sarah could see the boy who had lost his mother to senseless violence. "You didn't know her," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know what Detective Morrison wrote about her in his private files," Sarah replied. "She worked double shifts at the diner to put herself through nursing school. She volunteered at a literacy program for immigrant children. She wanted to heal people, David. She wanted to make the world better." Dr. Santos looked between Sarah and her partner, sensing the emotional shift in the room. "David, we need to proceed. The other cells are waiting for our signal." But Dr. Vasquez was staring at something beyond the camera, his attention caught by memories that Sarah's words had unlocked. "She used to sing while she studied," he said softly. "Medical textbooks spread across the kitchen table, and she'd hum this Spanish lullaby her grandmother taught her." "What were the words?" Sarah asked gently. "I can't remember," Dr. Vasquez admitted, and for the first time, he sounded like a lost child rather than a calculating killer. "I've tried for 30 years to remember, but they're gone." Agent Rodriguez had freed one hand and was working on the zip ties around his ankles. Agent Park was watching the exchange with professional interest, recognizing the psychological techniques Sarah was employing to destabilize the killer's resolve. "She wouldn't want you to forget who you were before she died," Sarah continued. "She wouldn't want her death to turn you into the same kind of monster that killed her." "I'm not a monster," Dr. Vasquez protested, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "I'm an instrument of justice." "You're a serial killer who's convinced himself he's a hero," Sarah said bluntly. "There's no difference between you and Thomas. Brennan, accept the story you tell yourself about your motives." The comparison clearly rattled him. Dr. Santos could see her partner wavering and moved to reassert control over the situation. "Enough psychology," she snapped, raising a scalpel toward Agent Torres's throat. "David, if you can't proceed, I will. The mission is bigger than any one person's doubts." But as she moved toward the bound agent, something unexpected happened. Judge Morrison, who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, began making urgent sounds behind his gag. His eyes were wide with recognition, and he was trying desperately to communicate something. Dr. Santos paused, curious despite herself. "What is it?" Against her better judgment, she loosened the gag enough for him to speak. "Maria Santos," Judge Morrison gasped. "I remember you now. You testified at my confirmation hearing 2 years ago." Dr. Santos froze, the scalpel trembling. In her hand, "What you spoke about your brother's case," Judge Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "You said the system had failed your family, but you also said that destroying the system wouldn't honor your brother's memory. You said the answer was reform, not revenge." Sarah watched Dr. Santos's face as the memory surfaced. Whatever had happened at that confirmation hearing, it clearly contradicted the narrative she'd built around her transformation into a killer. "That was before I understood how deep the corruption went," Dr. Santos said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Judge Morrison replied firmly. "That was before Dr. Vasquez found you and convinced you to abandon everything you believed in. I remember your exact words. My brother died because one person made a terrible choice. The system didn't kill him, a drunk driver did." The scalpel clattered to the floor as Dr. Santos stepped backward, the weight of her original beliefs crashing back into her consciousness. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the battle between grief-driven rage and the moral principles she'd held before meeting Dr. Vasquez. "David," Dr. Santos said slowly, "what have we done?" Dr. Vasquez was staring at the camera, perhaps seeing himself clearly for the first time in decades. The elaborate theater around them suddenly seemed less like a temple to justice and more like a monument to madness. "The other cells," he whispered, "they're waiting for our signal." Sarah realized that 12 other groups of people were poised to commit mass murder across the country, waiting for the footage from this basement to give them the courage to proceed with their own twisted performances. "You can stop this," she told him. "Right now, before anyone else dies. Send the signal to stand down." Agent Rodriguez had quietly freed himself and was moving toward the surgical instruments, ready to cut the restraints of the other victims. But Sarah gestured for him to wait. The psychological battle wasn't over yet. Dr. Vasquez picked up a communication device Sarah hadn't noticed before, a high-tech radio that could apparently reach the other cells across the country. His finger hovered over the transmit button as he wrestled with 30 years of carefully constructed justification. "If I stop this," he said, "my mother's death means nothing." "If you continue this," Sarah replied, "her death will mean the same thing as every other senseless murder, that violence only creates more violence, that pain only creates more pain." The basement fell silent as Dr. David Vasquez faced the choice that would define not just his legacy, but the future of vigilante justice in America. Dr. Vasquez's finger trembled over the transmit button as the weight of his decision pressed down on the basement like a physical force. Around the country, 47 people in 12 cities were waiting for his signal to begin simultaneous murders that would fundamentally alter the American justice system. "David," Dr. Santos said softly, "we can still walk away. We can disappear. Start over. Try to find another way to honor our lost family members." But Sarah could see something changing in Dr. Vasquez's eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there before. The psychological manipulation she'd been employing was working, but not in the way she'd intended. Instead of breaking down his resolve, she'd helped him understand the true scope of what he'd created. "No," he said quietly, "we can't walk away. Do you know how many people are going to die tonight if I send the signal?" He looked around the basement at the elaborate staging, the professional equipment, The bound victims who represented everything he'd convinced himself was wrong with. The world. Conservative estimate, based on what each cell has reported, 73 people, prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys, parole officers, police administrators, 73 people with families and children and dreams, all dying because a 5-year-old boy couldn't cope with losing his mother. Dr. Santos was crying now. The reality of their planned massacre finally penetrating the psychological armor she'd built around herself. David, I'm so sorry. I should have seen what we were becoming. You saw exactly what I wanted you to see, Dr. Vasquez replied. I've spent 15 years perfecting the art of turning grief into rage, of convincing broken people that murder could heal their wounds. Agent Rodriguez had freed Agent Torres and was working on the restraints holding Darweb and Judge Morrison. But everyone in the basement was focused on Dr. Vasquez and the communication device that could prevent or trigger the largest coordinated act of domestic terrorism in American history. The cells are expecting a go signal by 12:15 a.m., Dr. Vasquez said, checking his antique pocket watch. If they don't hear from me, they'll assume I've been compromised and will proceed with their individual operations. Sarah felt her heart sink. You're saying they'll kill those people whether you give the signal or not? Unless I send a specific abort code, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. But sending that code means admitting that everything we've built, every death we've justified, was meaningless. It wasn't meaningless if it leads to this moment, Sarah said. If it leads to you choosing to save 73 innocent lives. Dr. Vasquez looked at the camera that was still recording their conversation, perhaps thinking about the network members who would eventually see this footage. They trusted me, he said. 47 people opened their hearts to me, shared their most painful losses, allowed me to shape their grief into purpose. How do I tell them it was all a lie? By telling them the truth, Agent Torres said, his voice hoarse from the gag but firm with conviction. By admitting that you made mistakes and giving them the chance to make different choices. The truth, Dr. Vasquez repeated, as if the concept was foreign to him. The truth is that I've spent 30 years trying to bring my mother back by killing other people's mothers. The truth is that I became the very thing that destroyed my family. He raised the communication device and spoke into it with steady voice. All cells, this is David. Operation Hollow Man is officially terminated. Repeat, Operation Hollow Man is terminated. Stand down and disperse immediately. The responses came quickly, voices crackling through the radio with confusion and anger. Sarah could hear fragments of arguments, demands for explanation, threats of independent action. The network Dr. Vasquez had so carefully constructed was fragmenting in real time. David, what the hell is happening? Came one voice. We're in position and ready to proceed. Chicago cell reporting ready status. Are we go or no go? Los Angeles requesting confirmation of abort signal. Dr. Vasquez closed his eyes and spoke the words that would end his life's work. Authorization code Omega 77. All operations are permanently cancelled. Destroy all evidence and disappear. The network is compromised. The radio exploded with angry voices, but Dr. Vasquez switched it off and let it fall to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. It's done, he said simply. Dr. Santos had freed the remaining hostages and was helping them remove their gags and restraints. Her medical training had taken over, checking them for injuries and shock while processing the magnitude of what they'd almost done. Agent Torres, Sarah said, we need immediate contact with FBI field officers in all 12 cities. They need to know that potential terrorist cells are dispersing but may still be active. Torres was already on his radio, coordinating with the tactical teams that had been waiting outside the safe house. Within minutes, the basement was swarming with federal agents, crime scene photographers, and medical personnel. But Sarah found herself focused on Dr. Vasquez, who had sat down in one of the chairs that had been prepared for victims and was staring at the screen, where his mother's photograph was still projected. "What happens now?" he asked her. "Now you face the consequences of what you've done," Sarah replied. "But you also live with the knowledge that you prevented something much worse." Dr. Vasquez nodded slowly. 73 lives. That has to count for something. As the FBI agents placed him in custody, Dr. Vasquez turned back to Sarah one final time. "Detective Chen, will you do something for me?" "What?" "Find someone who knew my mother. Someone who remembers her lullabies. I want to remember her as she was, not as the excuse I used to become a monster." Sarah watched as they led him away. This man who had spent 30 years building an elaborate monument to his own pain. The basement theater would be dismantled. The network would be investigated and prosecuted, and the justice system would continue its imperfect work of balancing punishment and mercy. But somewhere in federal prison, Dr. David Vasquez would be trying to remember the words to a Spanish lullaby, hoping to find his way back to the 5-year-old boy who had lost his mother, before grief transformed him into something unrecognizable. The performance was over, but the real work of healing was just beginning. Detective Mike Sullivan looked like a man who hadn't slept in months. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of long nights wrestling with conscience and consequence. As he reached the bottom of the basement stairs, Sarah could see his hands shaking slightly. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" Sullivan glanced at the hollow man, who gave a subtle nod of encouragement, then back at Sarah. "Because the system is broken, Sarah. Because 30 years of trying to work within it, trying to believe in it, nearly destroyed me." He moved closer, and Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath. Not drunk, but drinking enough to numb whatever was eating at him from the inside. "I was a rookie when Elena Vasquez was murdered," Sullivan continued. 24 years old, fresh out of the academy, assigned to work the case with Detective Frank Morrison. God, I was so eager to prove myself, so sure we'd catch the bastard and see justice done. The hollow man adjusted the film projector, and new images appeared on the screen. Crime scene photos from 1994, police reports, interview transcripts. Sarah recognized Sullivan's handwriting in the margins of several documents. "We had him dead to rights," Sullivan said, his voice growing bitter. "DNA evidence, witness testimony, physical evidence that placed Thomas Brennan at the scene. It should have been life without parole, maybe even the death penalty. But the prosecutor made a deal," Sarah said, beginning to understand the depth of Sullivan's 30-year obsession. "Robert Chen, the businessman you found in the first basement, he was more interested in padding his conviction statistics than seeking real justice. Manslaughter with a recommendation for 12 years. Brennan would be out in 8 with good behavior." Sullivan ran his hands through his gray hair, and Sarah could see the weight of decades pressing down on him. "I tried to fight it, tried to convince Chen to take it to trial, but I was just a rookie. Who was going to listen to me over a prosecutor with political ambitions?" The hollow man spoke for the first time since Sullivan's arrival. "Detective Sullivan came to see me after Brennan was released. Did you know that, Detective Chen?" Your mentor sought out the son of a murder victim to apologize for the system's failure. Sarah looked back and forth between the two men, trying to process the implications of what she was hearing. Mike, you've been planning this for 20 years. Not planning, Sullivan protested. Not at first. I just wanted to, I don't know, make amends somehow. Elena's son was 18 when I found him, working 3 jobs to support himself. Brilliant mind wasted because he couldn't afford college. I helped him get a scholarship, kept in touch over the years. The screen showed photographs spanning decades. A young man graduating from college, then medical school, then what appeared to be film school. The progression told a story of someone methodically acquiring the skills he would need for his eventual revenge. His real name is David Vasquez, Sullivan said, looking at the masked figure. Dr. David Vasquez. Now he has degrees in medicine, psychology, and film production. Everything he'd need to become the perfect killer. Sarah felt sick as she realized the scope of the conspiracy, and you helped him every step of the way. I provided information, Sullivan admitted. Case files, personal details about the people involved in his mother's case. I told myself it was just so he could understand what really happened, find some kind of closure. Dr. Vasquez removed his mask for the first time, revealing a face that was both handsome and haunted. His features were refined, almost aristocratic, but his eyes held a coldness that made Sarah's skin crawl. Detective Sullivan's assistance was invaluable, Vasquez said in his cultured voice. But he was never meant to be directly involved in the physical aspects of my work. That was my burden alone. Until 6 months ago, Sarah said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. When you decided to go public with the murders, the private executions had served their purpose, Vasquez explained. Thomas Brennan's death gave me some measure of peace. But I realized that true justice required witness, required documentation. The world needs to see what happens when the system fails completely. Sullivan moved toward one of the unconscious agents, checking his pulse with the professional concern of someone who still cared about protecting life. David, this wasn't the plan. We agreed that Sarah would simply investigate, document the story, then walk away. No one else was supposed to get hurt. Plans evolve. Detective Sullivan, Vasquez replied coldly. Art demands sacrifice, and the story demands a more dramatic conclusion than we originally envisioned. Sarah saw her opening. The two men were focused on each other, their alliance showing cracks under pressure. She took a step toward the stairs, but Vasquez was watching her even while addressing Sullivan. Detective Chen, please don't make me sedate you as well. It would rob our finale of its emotional impact. What finale? Sarah demanded. What's the point of all this? Vasquez smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than his mask had been. The point, my dear detective, is to create a story so compelling, so perfectly documented, that it will never be forgotten. When the authorities find this basement tomorrow, they'll discover not just bodies, but a complete record of institutional failure spanning 3 decades. He gestured toward a stack of file boxes Sarah hadn't noticed in the corner. Every case, Detective Sullivan and I investigated every connection to my mother's murder. Every failure of the system that allowed killers to walk free. It's all there, catalogued and cross-referenced with the precision of a doctoral thesis. You're insane, Sarah said, but even as the words left her mouth, she could see the terrible logic in his plan. I'm thorough, Vasquez corrected. This basement will become a monument to the victims of judicial incompetence. The media will spend months analyzing every document, every photograph, every frame of film. My mother's story will finally receive the attention it deserved 30 years ago. Sullivan was backing away from Vasquez now, his face pale with the realization of how far his ally was prepared to go. David, we can still stop this. We can walk away, disappear, start over somewhere. Else, there is no walking away, Vasquez replied, raising the scalpel. The story demands its ending, and endings require sacrifice. But instead of moving towards Sarah or the unconscious agents, he turned the blade toward Sullivan. Your role is complete. Old friend, you've served your purpose admirably. Sarah watched in horror as Sullivan stumbled backward, his hands raised defensively. David, please, think about what you're doing. I'm thinking about what you've done, Vasquez said, his voice growing colder. 30 years of failure, 30 years of letting killers escape justice while you collected your pension and slept peacefully at night. Did you really think you could help me execute my vision and then simply walk away when it became inconvenient? The basement fell silent except for the steady clicking of the film projector and the shallow breathing of the unconscious agents. Sarah realized that she was witnessing the moment when the hollow man's carefully constructed alliance was about to collapse into chaos, and in that chaos she might find her only chance to survive. The scalpel gleamed in the projector's flickering light as Dr. Vasquez advanced on Sullivan. Sarah had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she watched two men destroy each other or found a way to save them all. Her police training took over. Instead of fleeing up the stairs, she lunged toward the nearest unconscious Agent Rodriguez and grabbed his service weapon from its holster. The movement caught Vasquez's attention just as he was raising the blade toward Sullivan's throat. Stop, Sarah commanded, leveling the gun at Vasquez. Put down the scalpel and step away from him. Vasquez froze, but his posture suggested amusement rather than fear. Detective Chen, you're disrupting the narrative flow. This scene requires Sullivan's death to propel us toward the climax. I'm changing the script, Sarah replied, her aim steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Mike, get behind me. But Sullivan didn't move. Instead, he looked at Vasquez with something that might have been resignation or relief. Sarah, you don't understand. I can't walk away from this. I'm already dead. Have been for years. What are you talking about? Sarah demanded, keeping the gun trained on Vasquez. Show her, Sullivan said to Vasquez. Show her the real reason I've been helping you. Vasquez smiled and moved to change the film reel again. New images appeared on the screen, photographs of a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with Sullivan's eyes and smile. Detective Sullivan's daughter, Emma Vasquez, explained. She died in a car accident 12 years ago. The driver was drunk, a repeat offender who should have been in prison but was released early due to overcrowding. Sarah felt her gun hand waver as she saw the pain in Sullivan's face. Mike, ... I tried to work within the system after that too, Sullivan said, his voice hollow. Filed appeals, fought for stricter sentencing guidelines, lobbied for victims' rights legislation, but nothing changed. The same prosecutors made the same deals, the same judges handed down the same lenient sentences. The screen showed newspaper clippings documenting Sullivan's crusade for justice reform, his testimonies before legislative committees, his increasingly desperate attempts to prevent other families from suffering as his had. When David found me 3 years ago, he offered something the system never could, Sullivan continued. The chance to actually make a difference, to ensure that the people responsible for these failures faced real consequences. By becoming murderers yourselves, Sarah said, though her conviction was wavering. By becoming instruments of justice, Vasquez corrected. The 3 people in the Brennan house basement weren't innocent bystanders, detective. They were complicit in a system that values expediency over truth, efficiency over justice. He moved toward another stack of files, and Sarah tracked him with the gun. Jennifer Martinez witnessed 3 different assault cases over the years. Each time, she refused to testify because she didn't want to get involved. 2 of those victims died because their attackers remained free. The screen showed court records, witness statements, and obituaries. The documentation was meticulous and damning. Robert Chen plea bargained away 47 cases during his career as a prosecutor. 47 killers and rapists who received reduced sentences in exchange for guilty pleas. 19 of them reoffended after their release. More documents flashed across the screen. Recidivism reports, new victim impact statements, families destroyed by the system's failures. And Patricia Webb, Vasquez continued, was present at 17 different emergency situations where her delays or negligence contributed to preventable deaths. The hospital administration knew about her pattern of behavior but chose to protect themselves from liability rather than disciplining her. Sarah felt the gun growing heavy in her hands as she absorbed the weight of evidence. Even if all of that is true, it doesn't justify murder, doesn't it? Vasquez asked, turning to face her directly. How many victims would still be alive if these 3 people had made different choices? How many families would still be whole if the system actually worked the way it was supposed to? Sullivan stepped closer to Sarah, his hands raised peacefully. Sarah, I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking. But sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing. Don't, Sarah warned. But Sullivan continued approaching. Emma would be 20 years old now, he said, tears forming in his eyes. She'd be in college, maybe thinking about her career in law enforcement like her old man. Instead, she's in the ground because a drunk driver got his 6th chance instead of a life sentence. Mike, that's not my fault, Sarah said. It's not anyone's fault here, isn't it? Vasquez interjected. You've spent 15 years working within a system that you know is fundamentally broken. How many cases have you seen plea bargained away? How many killers have you arrested only to watch them walk free on technicalities? Sarah's mind flashed through years of frustration, cases dismissed on procedural grounds, sentences that seemed laughably inadequate, victims' families who lost faith in the justice system she'd sworn to uphold. The difference between you and us, Vasquez continued, is that we stopped pretending the system could be reformed from within. We chose to create our own justice. The film projector clicked to the end of its reel, leaving the basement in near darkness, except for a single overhead bulb. In the shadows, Sarah could see the unconscious agents beginning to stir, whatever drug they'd been given, starting to wear off. Last chance, Detective Chen, Vasquez said, the scalpel once again in his hand. Take your place in the final scene, or watch me write an ending you'll regret for the rest of your very short life. Sarah looked at Sullivan, saw the plea in his eyes, and realized that she was trapped in a scenario where every choice led to tragedy. The question wasn't whether people would die in this basement, it was how many, and whether their deaths would serve Vasquez's twisted vision of justice. As Agent Rodriguez groaned and began to regain consciousness, Sarah made her decision. Sarah kept the gun trained on Vasquez as she spoke. There's something you haven't considered in your grand performance, Dr. Vasquez raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. And what would that be? You've spent 30 years studying the people who failed your mother, documenting their mistakes, planning their deaths. But you never studied me. She took a step closer, her aim never wavering. If you had, you'd know that I've spent the last 5 years investigating cold cases in my spare time. Cases where the system failed, where justice was never served. Sullivan looked at her with surprise, but Vasquez seemed genuinely interested. Continue. I reopened the Elena Vasquez case 18 months ago, Sarah said, watching both men's faces carefully, not officially. The department wouldn't authorize it, but on my own time. I found evidence that the original investigation missed, witnesses who were never interviewed, forensic techniques that weren't available in 1994. Agent Rodriguez was now fully conscious, though he was keeping still and listening to the conversation. Sarah could sense him evaluating the situation, waiting for the right moment to act. You found evidence, Vasquez said slowly. What kind of evidence? The kind that would have put Thomas Brennan away for life, Sarah replied. DNA samples from under your mother's fingernails that were never properly tested. Security camera footage from a gas station that showed Brennan's car in the area at the time of the murder. A witness who saw him disposing of bloody clothing but was never contacted by police. She could see Vasquez's composure cracking for the first time. That's impossible. I've been through every file, every piece of evidence. You've been through the official files, Sarah corrected, but I found the unofficial ones. Detective Morrison kept a second set of records, documenting evidence that was ignored or suppressed by the prosecutor's office. Sullivan was staring at her in shock. Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me about this? Because I wasn't sure who I could trust, she replied honestly. And because I wanted to be absolutely certain before I made any accusations about corruption. In the prosecutor's office, Vasquez lowered the scalpel slightly, his carefully controlled demeanor showing signs of strain. Morrison kept secret files. Morrison knew the case was being mishandled, Sarah continued. He documented everything, including pressure from the prosecutor's office to accept weak evidence and ignore stronger leads. He was planning to go public after his retirement, but he died of a heart attack before he could expose the truth. The basement fell silent except for the soft groaning of the other agents as they began to regain consciousness. Sarah could see Vasquez processing this new information, trying to fit it into his carefully constructed narrative. Where are these files now? He asked. Safe, Sarah replied. And they're set to be released automatically if anything happens to me. Your 30-year quest for justice was unnecessary. The evidence to convict your mother's killer was always there. But Brennan is dead, Vasquez said, his voice hollow. I killed him years ago. Yes, you did, Sarah agreed. And in doing so, you destroyed the only chance for your mother to receive real justice through the proper channels. The evidence I found could have been used to reopen the case, to expose the corruption that led to Brennan's reduced sentence. But now that he's dead, that opportunity is gone forever. Vasquez staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. Sarah could see his entire worldview crumbling as he realized the implications of what she was saying. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years of planning, of building this monument to justice, and you're telling me it was all pointless. Not pointless, Sarah said gently, but unnecessary. Your mother's story could have been told without becoming a killer yourself. The truth could have come out without destroying your life and the lives of innocent people. Sullivan was crying now, tears streaming down his weathered face. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought we were doing the right thing. I thought we were fixing what the system broke. You were trying to, Sarah acknowledged. But vigilante justice isn't justice at all. It's just revenge with better marketing. Agent Park was now conscious and alert, though she was playing possum while assessing the situation. Rodriguez was slowly reaching for something in his pocket, probably a backup weapon or communication device. Vasquez looked around the basement, theater he'd created, at the unconscious agents beginning to stir, at the elaborate documentation of his mother's case projected on the makeshift screen. So what happens now, Detective Chen? Do you arrest us? Do you add us to the system we've spent years fighting against? I'm going to give you the choice your mother never had, Sarah replied. The choice to live. She lowered the gun slightly, though she kept it ready. Dr. Vasquez, you have medical training. You could save lives instead of taking them. Sullivan, you have 30 years of experience fighting for victims. You could use that knowledge to actually reform the system instead of destroying it. After everything we've done, Sullivan asked. After everything you've done, Sarah confirmed. The question is whether you want your story to end here, in this basement, or whether you want to write a different ending. Vasquez was staring at the projection screen, where his mother's photograph was still visible. She would have wanted justice, not revenge. Then help me get it for her, Sarah said. The right way this time. As the other agents fully regained consciousness and began to assess the situation, Sarah realized that the Hollow Man's carefully scripted performance was about to become an improvisation. The question was whether they could rewrite the ending before it was too late for all of them. Dr. Vasquez set down the scalpel and moved away from both Sarah and Sullivan, his movements suddenly uncertain. For 30 years, he had been driven by a singular purpose, and Sarah's revelation had shattered the foundation of everything he believed. Agent Rodriguez was now fully alert and had palmed his backup weapon, but Sarah gestured for him to wait. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and any sudden movement could send it spiraling into violence. Show me, Vasquez said quietly. Show me these files you claim Morrison kept. Sarah holstered Rodriguez's weapon and pulled out her phone. The files are in my car, but I have photos of some of the key documents. She scrolled through her gallery, finding images she'd taken of Morrison's hidden evidence. The first photograph showed a DNA analysis report dated 3 weeks after Brennan's arrest. The results clearly indicated genetic material under Elena Vasquez's fingernails that matched Brennan's profile with 99.7% certainty. In the margin, someone had written, "Prosecutor refuses to submit as evidence, says existing confession is sufficient." Vasquez studied the image, his hands trembling slightly. This would have guaranteed a murder conviction. The second piece, Sarah continued, showing another photograph, is security footage from Miller's gas station, 2 miles from where your mother's body was found. The timestamp shows Brennan's car at 11:47 p.m. on the night of the murder. The grainy black and white image clearly showed a vehicle matching Brennan's make and model, with a license plate that was partially visible. Morrison had enhanced the image by hand, circling the identifiable numbers. The witness, Sarah said, showing a third photograph of a handwritten statement, was a homeless man named Carl Tucker, who saw Brennan burning clothes behind the gas station. Tucker was afraid to come forward initially because he was trespassing, but Morrison found him 3 days later and took a detailed statement. Vasquez sank into one of the empty chairs, the weight of 30 years of misdirected rage finally catching up with him. Tucker was murdered 6 months after my mother, he said in a hollow voice. I thought it was unrelated. It wasn't, Sarah. Confirmed. Someone wanted to make sure he could never testify. But Morrison had already documented his statement and hidden copies of all the evidence. Sullivan wiped his eyes and looked at Sarah with something approaching admiration. How long have you known about our connection? I suspected something when the crime scene was discovered, Sarah admitted. The level of detail about the original case, the personal nature of the revenge, the fact that you were specifically requested for the investigation team. When I saw you weren't surprised by the staging, I knew you were involved somehow. Agent Rodriguez finally spoke up from his chair. Detective Chen, I need to call this in. We have federal agents down and 2 suspects in custody. Not yet, Sarah said. There's something else we need to understand first. She turned back to Vasquez. Doctor, you said the private executions served their purpose. How many others have there been? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, staring at his mother's photograph on the screen. 17, he finally admitted. Over the past 15 years, all connected to cases where the system failed catastrophically. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 17 murders, carefully planned and executed, while she'd been working just a few miles away, completely oblivious to the systematic elimination of people Vasquez deemed complicit in judicial failure. The judge who gave the drunk driver probation instead of jail time. Vasquez began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a familiar litany. The defense attorney who got a child molester's charges reduced to a misdemeanor. The parole officer who recommended early release for a violent offender who killed again within a month. Each name he spoke was accompanied by images on the screen, newspaper clippings, court records, death certificates. The scope of his research was staggering, spanning multiple states and decades. And you helped him, Sarah said to Sullivan. You provided access to case files, personal information, investigative resources. Sullivan nodded miserably. I told myself it was research. David was writing a book about system failures, exposing corruption through legitimate channels. I didn't realize he was actually killing people until it was too late to stop. When did you find out the truth? Agent Park asked, now fully conscious and watching the conversation with professional intensity. 6 months ago, Sullivan replied. David showed me photographs of his work, told me about his plans to go public with the murders. By then, I was already so deep in the conspiracy that I couldn't see a way out. So you helped him plan the theatrical murders, Sarah concluded. The basement stages, the eye replacements, the films. I tried to convince him to stop, Sullivan protested. But he said the private murders weren't having enough impact. He wanted to create something that would force society to confront the system's failures. Vasquez had been listening to this conversation with growing agitation. You make it sound like madness, but look at the evidence, he said, gesturing toward the files and photographs. Look at the patterns of failure, the consistent prioritization of bureaucratic convenience over human life. He stood and began pacing, his composure completely shattered now. 17 families received justice because of my work. 17 killers who would have continued to walk free were stopped permanently. And now 17 more families are grieving, Sarah pointed out. The families of the people you murdered. They were complicit in a broken system, Vasquez insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. They were human beings, Sarah replied. Flawed, maybe even negligent, but human beings with families and friends who loved them. The basement fell silent as the weight of this simple truth settled over them. In the flickering light, of the projector. Sarah could see the exact moment when Dr. David Vasquez realized that his 30-year quest for justice had transformed him into the very thing he'd set out to destroy. Killer who justified his actions by blaming his victims. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Dr. Vasquez stood frozen in the center of the basement, his elaborate theater suddenly seeming less like a monument to justice and more like the delusions of a broken man. Agent Rodriguez had quietly alerted backup through his concealed communication device, and Sarah could hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching the safe house. But she knew that the next few minutes would determine whether this ended with arrests or a bloodbath. "David," Sullivan said quietly, using Vasquez's first name for the first time since Sarah had known them. "It's over. We both know it's over." Vasquez turned toward his longtime ally, and Sarah could see the last vestiges of sanity warring with 3 decades of carefully nurtured rage. "I can't stop now, Mike. Not when we're so close to completing the story." "What story?" Sarah demanded. "The story of a grieving son who became a monster. The story of a detective who betrayed everything he swore to protect. This isn't justice, David. This is just pain spreading like cancer from one person to another." The film projector clicked to a stop, leaving them in the dim glow of the single overhead bulb. In the sudden quiet, they could all hear the sound of boots on the floors above. The FBI tactical team was in position. "They're going to storm this basement in about 2 minutes, Agent Park said, her voice calm and professional. "Dr. Vasquez, if you surrender now, you might live long enough to tell your mother's story the right way." But Vasquez wasn't listening. He was staring at the screen where his mother's photograph was still projected, her young face smiling at the camera without any knowledge of the tragedy that would soon befall her, or the monster her death would create. "She used to sing to me," he said suddenly, his voice breaking. "Every night before bed, she'd sing this Spanish lullaby her grandmother taught her. I can't remember the words anymore." Sullivan took a step toward him. "David, we can find the words. We can find people who knew her, who remember her songs. But not if this ends with you dying in this basement." "I've killed 17 people, Mike," Vasquez said, tears now streaming down his face. 17 human beings who had families and dreams and fears just like my mother did. How do I live with that? The same way I've lived with letting you do it," Sullivan replied. "One day at a time, trying to find some way to make amends." The sound of tactical boots was getting closer. Sarah could hear commands being shouted, doors being breached, the systematic clearing of the upper floors. They had maybe 60 seconds before the basement was flooded with armed agents, who wouldn't hesitate to shoot if they perceived a threat. "Detective Chen," Vasquez said, turning to her with something that might have been respect. "You said you could prove my mother deserved justice through legitimate channels. Will you?" "I will," Sarah promised. "Not just for her, but for all the victims. Your mother's and yours." Vasquez nodded slowly, then did something that surprised everyone in the basement. He knelt down and placed the scalpel on the floor, then put his hands behind his head in a gesture of surrender. "Mike," he said without looking at Sullivan, "I'm sorry for all of it, for what I became, for what I made you become." Sullivan was crying openly now. "I'm sorry too, David. I failed you just like everyone else failed your mother." The tactical team burst through the basement door with military precision, red laser sights painting targets across the dark room. Sarah immediately raised her hands and identified herself, while the agents on the floor remained still to avoid being shot by nervous operators. Suspects in custody, came the shouted commands. Basement secure. As federal agents swarmed the room, Sarah watched Dr. David Vasquez being cuffed and read his rights. The man who had terrorized her for days, who had murdered 17 people in his quest for justice, looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of his crimes. Sullivan was also being arrested, though the agents were gentler with him, recognizing his cooperation in the final moments. As they led him past Sarah, he stopped and looked her in the eye. Elena Vasquez deserved better than what happened to her, he said, but she also deserved better than what her son became. Don't let his crimes overshadow her memory. Sarah nodded, understanding the burden he was passing to her. The case of Elena Vasquez would be reopened. The corruption in the prosecutor's office would be exposed, and the truth would finally come to light. But it would all happen 30 years too late to save anyone from the tragedy that had unfolded. In its absence, as the basement emptied of everyone except the crime scene technicians, Sarah found herself alone with the remnants of the Hollow Man's Theater. The projection screen still showed Elena Vasquez's smiling face, frozen in a moment of happiness before her world went dark. The real tragedy, Sarah realized, wasn't just that Elena had been murdered, or that her killer had received an inadequate sentence. It was that her death had created another killer, and that killer's actions had destroyed even more lives in an endless cycle of pain and retribution. Justice, true justice, would have broken that cycle before it started. Instead, the system's failure had fed it for 3 decades, creating monsters where it should have created healing. 6 months later, Sarah stood in a packed courtroom as Dr. David Vasquez was sentenced to life without parole for 17 counts of first-degree murder. The media attention had been intense, with every detail of the case dissected by talking heads and true crime podcasts. The basement theater had become a symbol of how far someone could fall when the system failed them completely. Detective Mike Sullivan had received a lesser sentence in exchange for his cooperation and testimony about the corruption in the prosecutor's office. The information he provided had led to a federal investigation that resulted in 3 convictions and a complete overhaul of the local justice system. But for Sarah, the most important moment had come 2 weeks earlier, when she'd testified before a state legislative committee about the need for cold case review boards and mandatory sentence guidelines for violent crimes. Elena Vasquez's case had become the poster child for reform, her death finally serving the cause of justice after 30 years. Sarah had kept her promise to expose the truth about Elena's murder. The evidence she'd found in Detective Morrison's hidden files had been enough to posthumously clear several other cold cases and identify patterns of prosecutorial misconduct that went back decades. Robert Chen, the prosecutor who had pleaded Brennan's case, had died 3 years earlier from cancer, but his successor was now facing federal charges for corruption and civil rights violations. The system was finally being held accountable for its failures, though it had taken a trail of bodies to force that accountability. As Sarah left the courthouse, she was approached by a young woman with dark hair and Elena Vasquez's eyes. Detective Chen, I'm Maria Vasquez, David's younger sister. I wanted to thank you. Sarah was surprised. Thank me. For giving him the chance to surrender, Maria explained. For treating him like a human being instead of just a monster. I know what he did was terrible, but he's still my brother. He's still Elena's son. They walked together toward the parking garage, and Maria continued. I was only 2 when our mother died, so I don't remember her. David was the one who kept her memory alive, who told me stories about her songs and her dreams. But somewhere along the way, his love for her became something poisonous. He thought he was honoring her memory, Sarah said. Maybe at first, Maria agreed. But by the end, I think he was just trying to fill the hollow place inside himself. Where she used to be. The murders, the elaborate staging, the films. It was all an attempt to create meaning from meaningless loss. Sarah thought about the basement theater, about the glass doll eyes, and the careful documentation of each killing. Do you think he found what he was looking for? Maria was quiet for a moment. I think he found the truth, finally. That no amount of revenge could bring her back, and that becoming a killer only dishonored her memory. They reached Sarah's car, and Maria handed her a small wrapped package. This is for you. David asked me to give it to you after the trial. Inside the package was a photograph Sarah had never seen before. Elena Vasquez holding both her children, maybe a year before her death. She was laughing at something off camera, her face radiant with joy and life. On the back, someone had written in David's careful handwriting, "This is how she should be remembered." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she studied the image. This was the woman who had deserved justice, not the victim whose death had spawned 30 years of violence and revenge. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked Maria. "Try to rebuild our family's name," Maria replied. David established a scholarship fund for children who lost parents to violence. "I'm going to continue that work. Try to create something positive from all this darkness." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the strange path that had led her to this moment. The Hollow Man's story was over, but the larger questions it raised would continue to haunt the justice system for years to come. How many other David Vasquezes were out there, nursing 30-year-old wounds and planning elaborate revenge? How many victims of the system's failures would choose violence over patience, revenge over reform? Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Torres, who had returned to his office in Washington. New case in Baltimore. Similar staging, theatrical elements. Interested? Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. She'd had enough of monsters and the monsters they created. It was time to focus on preventing tragedies instead of simply documenting them after the fact. But as she pulled into her driveway, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, another broken person was planning another elaborate performance, another monument to the system's failures built from human suffering. The Hollow Man's theater had gone dark, but the show, she feared, would go on. Elena Vasquez's photograph sat on Sarah's dashboard, a reminder that behind every case file and crime scene, there was once a person who laughed and sang lullabies and dreamed of a future that would never come. That person deserved to be remembered for who she was, not for what her death had created. Justice, Sarah had learned, wasn't about perfect endings or satisfying conclusions. It was about choosing to keep trying, even when the system failed, even when the cycle of violence seemed impossible to break. It was about remembering that every victim had once been someone's everything, and that their memory deserved better than becoming a footnote in someone else's revenge story. The Hollow Man had spent 30 years trying to fill the empty space his mother's death had left inside him. But emptiness, Sarah realized, couldn't be filled with more emptiness. It could only be healed by choosing to create light instead of spreading darkness. As she sat in her car, holding Elena's photograph, Sarah made her own choice about how this story would end. Tomorrow, she would begin working on the cold case review board that Elena's death had finally made possible. She would fight for the reforms that might prevent another David Vasquez from losing himself to grief and rage. The Hollow Man's performance was over, but the real work of justice was just beginning. And somewhere in a federal prison, Dr. David Vasquez was learning to live with the silence where his mother's lullabies used to be, trying to remember the words to songs that might have saved them, both if he'd chosen to sing them instead of seeking to silence others. The basement theater was empty now, its chairs facing a blank screen where no more horrors would be projected. But the story it told would echo through the justice system for years to come. A reminder of what happened when grief was allowed to fester in darkness instead of being brought into the light of truth and healing. Elena Vasquez had finally received her justice, not through the elaborate revenge her son had orchestrated, but through the simple act of remembering her as she was, a young mother who sang lullabies and deserved to live. The Hollow Man's story was over, but hers was just beginning to be told properly. The end.